Welcome to Value Plays Only, where Protean Hulk just searches up some mana dorks. Today, we have Alban from the Top Deckers, playing Gwendlyn Di Corci. This spicy pile has no relation to its commander. It's a good stuff Grixis core built to prove that 99 can outshine most commanders. It wins with Thrasios Oracle or Underworld Breach. His hand contains a Dark Ritual, Opposition Agent, VV Orniteer, Demonic Tutor, Arcane Signet, Badlands, and Underground Sea. Nick, also from the Top Deckers, is playing Thrasios, Triton Hero, and Tymna the Weaver. This deck leverages two card advantage engines in the command zone to piece together either an infinite mana or Thrasios Oracle win. His hand contains a Carpet of Flowers, Mystic Remora, Arcane Signet, Derevi Imperial Tactician, Fierce Guardianship, Pact of Negation, and Windswept Teeth. John is playing Rograkh, Son of Rograkh, and Tevesh Szat, Doom of Fools. This deck is hell on earth. It looks to polymorph its commanders into horrible threats, denying resources and winning by causing all your friends to leave the room. His hand contains Chrome Mox, Infernal Plunge, The One Ring, Voltaic Key, Luca, Coppercoat Outcast, Mana Confluence, and Bloodstained Mire. Dan is playing Elsha of the Infinite. This is an instant speed top deck combo deck. It can win with Sensei's Divining Top and a Cost Reducer or Underworld Breach. His hand contains an Esper Sentinel, Soul Ring, Talisman of Progress, Sensei's Divining Top, Fierce Guardianship, and Steam Vents. His London Mulligan is a Ranger Captain of Eos. And with that, let's see some value plays. Alban starts things off with an Underground Sea as land for turn. He passes the turn. Nick plays a Windswept Teeth as land for turn. He pays life and cracks it. In response, Alban casts Dark Ritual. The table fielder alive shortening as Alban adds 3 black mana. He casts Opposition Agent. Nick is blown back in his seat by the Audacity. The fetch resolves, and Alban searches up an Underground Sea into exile with Oppo. This is an illegal fetch, but in his great despair, Nick didn't notice. Totally blown out, and with no game plan left, Nick passes the turn. Seeing what happened with Nick, John is happy about his mulligan. He plays Mana Confluence as land for turn. He casts his commander, Rograkh, Son of Rograkh. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Luca, Coppercoat Outcast as it enters. He casts Infernal Plunge, sacrificing Rograkh as an additional cost. He taps out to cast The One Ring, feeling great about disregarding the Oppo. In response, Alban casts Force of Negation, pitching VV Orniteer as an alternate cost. John is gobsmacked, as he and Nick huddle in the dead player's corner together. The One Ring is countered and exiled. John has no other plays and passes the turn. Dan takes his first turn while staring at the smoldering corpses of John and Nick. He plays a Steam Vents as land for turn, into play untap, paying 2 life. He casts a Soul Ring. He then casts Talisman of Progress. He casts an Esper Sentinel. John and Nick stare at their empty boards, then at Dan, then at Alban, who passes priority on all this. Happy with his start, Dan passes the turn. Alban untaps and draws. He plays Underground Sea from exile as land for turn. Alban casts Arcane Signet. Esper triggers and Dan draws. He then passes the turn. Nick untaps and draws. He takes no game actions and passes the turn, discarding the hand size. John untaps and draws. He plays a Shatter Skull, a Hammer Pass, into play untap, paying 3 life. He recasts his commander, Rograkh, Son of Rograkh. He then casts a Voltaic Key. Esper triggers and Dan draws. John passes the turn. Dan untaps and draws. He plays Gemstone Caverns as land for turn. He casts Lotus Petal. Dan casts his commander, Elsha of the Infinite. He looks at the top card of his library and passes the turn. Alban untaps and draws. He plays Badlands as land for turn. He casts a Demonic Tutor. Esper triggers and he pays. Dan hems and haws a bit, but decides he doesn't like anyone else developing and casts Fierce Guardianship, countering Demonic Tutor. Alban then passes the turn. Nick untaps nothing and draws. He plays a sad Verdant Catacombs while staring menacingly at Alban. Nick passes the turn. John untaps and draws. He plays a Bloodstained Mire as land for turn. He casts Desperate Ritual. Esper triggers and Dan draws. John adds 3 red mana and spends it on a Karn, the Great Creator. It resolves, and John uses the -2 ability of Karn to add the One Ring in exile back to his hand. John then passes the turn. Dan untaps and draws. He plays a City of Brass as land for turn. He casts a Static Prison off the top of his library with Elsha. Prowess triggers to get +1/+1. Alban asks Dan what his plan with this is, but Dan won't commit to an answer. Alban casts Mental Misstep to counter the prison. Esper triggers and he pays. Static Prison is countered, and then Dan goes to combat, swinging Elsha at Karn. John blocks with Rograkh, and Dan passes the turn. Alban untaps and draws. He casts a Fellwar Stone. Esper triggers and he pays. With no good plays of his own to make, Alban passes the turn. Nick untaps nothing for the 4th time. He takes no game actions and passes the turn, discarding the hand size. John untaps and draws. He activates the +1 ability of Karn to make his Voltaic Key into a 1/1. John passes the turn. Dan untaps and draws. He plays a Plateau as land for turn. He casts an Arcane Signet. Prowess triggers to get +1/+1. Dan goes to combat and swings Elsha at Karn. In response, John casts Red Elemental Blast, targeting Elsha. Esper triggers and he pays. Dan responds by casting a mental misstep off the top of his library with Elsha. REB is countered, and John blocks Elsha with Voltaic Key. In his second main phase, Dan casts Counterbalance off the top of his library. Prowess triggers again. Dan then passes the turn. Alban untaps and draws. He takes no game actions, fully stalled out, and has to pass the turn. Nick keeps with tradition. He draws and discards the hand size, wondering where this game went wrong. John untaps and draws. He activates the +1 ability of Karn on Alban's Arcane Signet. He passes the turn. Dan untaps and draws. He casts Sensei's Divining Top. Prowess triggers. Alban responds with a Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a Dress down as an alternate cost. Esper triggers and he pays. Counterbalance triggers and Dan declines. With that, Sensei's is countered and the table does a small cheer. They then remember this means they're still in this game and lose all spirits again. Dan casts Narset, Parter of Veils. Prowess triggers again. Dan then plays Wooded Foothills as a land for turn. He activates the -2 ability of Narset, looking at the top 4 and adding Deflecting Swat to hand. He then passes the turn. Alban untaps and draws. He casts a Rhystic Study. Esper and Counterbalance trigger. Dan reveals a Savine's Reclamation, countering Rhystic, and then draws. Alban, devoid of hope, passes the turn. Nick does his small annual mill of 1 and passes the turn. John untaps and draws. He activates the +1 ability of Karn with no target and has to pass the turn. Dan untaps and draws. He activates the -2 ability of Narset, adding Gitaxian Probe to hand. He then casts Get Probe targeting John. Prowess triggers. He looks at John's sad excuse for a hand and then draws a card. Dan follows this up with a Savine's Reclamation, targeting Sensei's Divining Top. Prowess triggers again. Top then returns to the battlefield. Dan goes to combat, swinging Elsha and Esper at Karn. Karn takes 6 and dies. In his second main phase, Dan activates Sensei's Divining Top to draw a card and put Top on top. He then pays 1 to recast Top. He casts Swords to Plowshares, targeting Opposition Agent. Oppo is exiled, and Dan casts a Gamble. In response, Nick pays a life and cracks Verdant Catacombs. In response, Dan pays a life for both Wooded Foothills and Windswept Teeth to crack them. In response, John pays a life and cracks Bloodstained Mire, fetching up a Badlands, and fetches up a Tundra and a Volcanic Island, and then Nick gets a Bayou. The table breathed the fresh air just in time to die, as Gamble resolves. Dan searches up a card in hand and randomly discards Deflecting Swat. He casts Helm of Awakening. In response, Nick casts Demonic Consultation. Counterbalance and Esper trigger. Dan draws, and in response to Counterbalance, he activates Sensei's Divining Top, drawing a card and putting Top on top. Counterbalance then reveals Sensei's Divining Top, countering Consultation. Helm then resolves, and Dan is free to present his win. He casts Top off the top of his library for 0 mana through Helm. He then activates it to draw a card and put Top back on top. He does this over and over, drawing through most of his library. He then starts casting piles of mana rocks to build up his Storm count before casting Brain Freeze, with Storm count 100, milling out all of his opponents. Dan passes the turn. One by one, his opponents try to draw from an empty library and lose the game. With that, Dan wins the game. Today, we have a 2-for-1 deal. In this game, Nick is again playing Thrasios, Triton Hero, and Tymna the Weaver. His hand contains a Lotus Petal, Arcane Signet, Vampiric Tutor, Growing Rites of Itlamok, Verdant Catacombs, Starting Town, and Scrubland. John is again playing Rograkh, Son of Rograkh, and Tevesh Szat, Doom of Fools. His hand contains a Tainted Pact, Transmogrify, Tezzeret Cruel Captain, Gemstone Caverns, Urza Saga, and a Phyrexian Tower. His London Mulligan is a Sulphurous Spring. Dan is again playing Elsha of the Infinite. His hand contains a Lotus Petal, Mana Vault, Grim Monolith, Displacer Kitten, Windswept Teeth, and Mana Confluence. His London Mulligan is a Swan Song. Alban is again playing Gwendlyn Di Corci. His hand contains a Mystic Remora, Snapcaster Mage, Gifts Ungiven, Pact of Negation, Training Center, City Brass, and Arid Mesa. And with that, let's see some value plays. John has a pre-game action, putting Gemstone Caverns into play, exiling Tainted Pact. Nick then starts things off with a Starting Town. He casts a Lotus Petal. Nick then passes the turn. John untaps and draws. He casts his commander, Rograkh, Son of Rograkh. John plays Phyrexian Tower as land for turn. He activates it, sacrificing Rograkh for 2 black mana. He casts Tezzeret, Cruel Captain. It resolves, and John uses the -3 loyalty ability of Tezzeret to search up Mana Vault to hand. He then passes the turn. Dan plays a Windswept Teeth as land for turn. He pays a life and cracks it, fetching up a Tundra. He casts a Lotus Petal. Dan casts a Mana Vault. He then passes the turn. Alban plays a Training Center as land for turn. He casts Mystic Remora. In response, Nick casts Vampiric Tutor. He searches up a card to the top of his library and loses 2 life. Remora then resolves, and Alban passes the turn. Nick untaps and draws. He plays a Verdant Catacombs as land for turn. He pays life and cracks it, fetching up an Underground Sea. He casts Rhystic Study. Remora triggers, and Alban draws. Rhystic resolves, and Nick passes the turn. John untaps and draws. He plays a Command Tower as land for turn. He casts some Mana Vault. Mystic and Rhystic trigger, and Nick and Alban draw. It enters and Tezzeret triggers to get a loyalty. John taps Mana Vault for 3 mana. He activates the 0 loyalty ability of Tezzeret to untap it, and floats 3 more mana. He casts his other commander, Tevesh Szat, Doom of Fools. Mystic and Mystic trigger, John pays for Nick and Alban draws. He activates the +2 ability of Tevesh to make 2 thralls. He then recasts Rograkh, Mystic triggers, and Nick draws. John then passes the turn. Dan untaps and draws. He plays a Mana Confluence as land for turn. He casts his commander, Elsha of the Infinite. Mystic triggers and he pays. Dan then passes the turn. Alban untaps and in his upkeep he pays to keep Remora. He plays a Polluted Delta as land for turn. He pays life and cracks it, fetching up an Underground Sea. Alban casts a Dark Ritual. Mystic triggers and Nick draws. The table all stand a bit on edge, but Alban says it's not that kind of Dark Ritual. He adds 3 black mana. Alban spends 2 on a Talisman of Dominance. Mystic triggers and he pays. Alban then passes the turn. Nick untaps and draws. He plays a Savannah as land for turn. He casts an Arcane Signet. Remora triggers and Alban draws. Nick casts Carpet of Flowers. Remora triggers and Alban draws. Nick goes to his second main phase and adds 1 blue mana from his carpet. He casts his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. Nick then passes the turn. John untaps and draws. Mana Vault deals 1 to him. He activates the 0 loyalty ability of Tezzeret to untap it. He plays Urza Saga as land for turn, getting its first counter. John casts Transmogrify, targeting a Thrall. Mystic and Mystic trigger. In response, John holds priority and casts Flare of Duplication, targeting Transmogrify, sacrificing Rograkh as an additional cost. Mystic and Mystic trigger. John pays for Nick and then Alban draws. Priority passes around slowly and Flare resolves, copying Transmogrify on his other Thrall. The Thrall is exiled and John starts revealing until he puts a Sire of Sanity onto the battlefield. Nick and Alban then draw. The original Transmogrify resolves, exiling the other Thrall to put a Valgavoth, Terror Eater, into play. The table now get very worried about what's going to happen to the big draw engine hands. John then activates the +2 ability of Tevesh to create 2 more Thralls. He sacrifices 1 to Phyrexian Tower to cast Damping Sphere. Mystic and Mystic trigger, and Nick and Alban draw. In response, Alban casts Vampiric Tutor. Mystic triggers and Nick draws. Alban searches up a card at the top of his library and loses 2 life. Vamp Tutor goes to the Valgavoth zone. John moves to his end step and Sire of Insanity triggers, and each player discards their hand into exile under Valgavoth. Still in the end step, John casts Abrupt Decay for 2 life from Valgavoth, targeting Alban's Talisman. Mystic and Mystic trigger, and both players draw. With that, the Talisman is destroyed, and the turn moves to Dan. Dan untaps and draws. He casts a Rite of Flame off the top of his library. Prowess, Mystic, and Mystic trigger. Nick and Alban draw, and then Dan looks at the next card, but doesn't see any better answers. He has to pass the turn. In his end step, Sire triggers to discard all hands yet again into the Valgavoth pile. Alban untaps, and in his upkeep, he lets his Remora die. He casts Into the Floodmaw, targeting Sire of Insanity. Mystic triggers and Nick draws. Sire is bounced, and Alban goes to pass the turn. In his end step, Dan flashes into Chrome Mox. Mystic triggers and Nick draws. Dan has nothing to imprint, and the turn moves to Nick. Nick untaps and draws. He casts his other commander, Tymna the Weaver. Nick goes to combat, swinging Thrasios at Alban. He takes the damage. In his second main phase, Tymna and Carpet trigger. Nick adds a black and then loses a life and draws a card. Under Damping Sphere, he has to pass the turn. John untaps, and in his upkeep, he pays a life to cast Into the Floodmaw, targeting Ristic, promising Alban a fish. Ristic triggers and Nick draws. Ristic is then bounced. Still in his upkeep, John pays a life and 1 extra mana for Vampiric Tutor. He searches up a card at the top of his library and loses 2 life. He then draws, and Mana Vault deals 1 to him. In his main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. John activates the 0 loyalty ability of Tezzeret to untap Mana Vault. He activates the +2 ability of Tevesh Szat to make 2 more Thralls. He plays Volcanic Island as land for turn. John recasts Sire of Insanity. Nick Pinwheel slams a Mindbreak Trap. Under Damping Sphere, John can't respond here. The table cheer as Sire is exiled for good, and John passes the turn. Dan untaps and draws. Mana Vault deals 1 to him. Dan has no good plays and has to pass the turn. Alban untaps and draws. He goes to combat and swings the fish at Tevesh Szat. John blocks with Valgavoth and kills the fish. Needing to hold up something under Damping Sphere, Alban opts to cast Demonic Consultation. It resolves and names Flusterstorm. He exiles only 15 or so cards before finding Flusterstorm, adding it to his hand. He then passes the turn. Nick untaps and draws. In his first main phase, Carpet adds 1 black mana. Nick goes straight to combat. He swings Thrasios at Alban and Tymna at Dan. They both take the damage to try and help Nick draw into an out to this horrible board. In his second main phase, Tymna triggers to lose 2 and draw 2 cards. He plays a Windswept Heath as land for turn. Nick pays a life and cracks it, fetching up a Tropical Island. He casts a Wishclaw Talisman. It enters with 3 counters. Determined to try in the face of John's growing board, he activates Wishclaw, searching up a card to hand and giving Wishclaw to Alban. Nick then passes the turn. John untaps, and in his upkeep, he casts Enlightened Tutor for 1 life. He searches up a Nether Void to the top of his library. He then draws for turn, and Mana Vault deals 1 to him. In his main phase, Urza Saga gets its 3rd counter. In response, John floats a mana, and then searches up a Soul Ring to the battlefield. Tezzeret triggers to get a counter. Finally, with an open game state, John casts Displacer Kitten from exile for 4 life. He then activates the -10 ability of Tevesh Szat, killing it. In response, Nick casts Deadly Rollick, targeting Valgavoth. Ward triggers, and Nick sacrifices his commanders and carpet to Valgavoth to keep them from getting caught up in the Tevesh Szat ability. In response, John casts Gifts Ungiven for 4 life, targeting Alban. Displacer Kitten triggers, targeting Valgavoth. The table now realize how bad their scenario is. Alban steps in here, doing what he can, and casts Flusterstorm, with all 5 copies targeting Gifts Ungiven. Gifts is countered, and then Deadly Rollick fizzles, then Tevesh Szat's ability puts Rograkh, Tevesh, Elsha, and Gwendlyn onto John's board. John then sacrifices a Thrall to Phyrexian Tower to cast a 7-mana Nether Void. At this point, no one has any commanders, hands, graveyards, or the ability to cast any spells. They all see the writing on the wall and scoop it up. And with that, John wins the game. So, what did we learn today? If you're tired of the Rhystic Study meta, try just stealing your opponent's hands and commanders. That should even out the advantage. Also, if you're going to blow 2 players to bits, make sure you have a plan for the third. If you have any tips for the video, leave them below. Subscribe if you feel like it. Until next time, keep making value plays.
Windswept Teeth,
I'm
gonna crack it.
Okay, I'll respond.
Are you serious? Are you serious?
I'd like to respond to your cracking of your fetch.
Will you crack
Is
your
this
fetch?
true?
Oh
Okay,
go ahead.
I'll crack it.
Big
I'll
yeah.
crack this.
Yeah.
I'll pay 1.
Dude, what a snap
I'll
game.
play a Dark Ritual.
No way.
No way.
Okay.
Is this resolve? Play this.
Wow.
Can I scoop?
Wow.
Yeah, nice.
Oh my god.
Dude, you absolutely destroyed my whole game plan. You don't take our audio on this, right?
Right.
Bro, what the hell?
You shouldn't have cracked the fetch land. I was trying to give you a warning. You didn't see the
Shouldn't
wink.
he crack that
You
fetch?
didn't see the wink?
The wondering. Wow, he's so powerful.
Force the
Holy
negation
cow.
pitch with BB.
I'm just saying, I think it's best for you to put him in the dirt because we're already dead. If you want to see what happens, though,
No, I
and
mean,
save it,
that's
like,
fair.
I'm not
That's
going to
fair.
put him with
I'll
the
do it.
stack.
I'll do it. I'm gonna cast it.
What are you saving it
Good.
for?
This is good.
So when do you decide if a game is not usable?
Dan better present something soon. I'm fucking.
Dude, I'm
blanking
trying
now.
to get to cards.
Wow. Great.
Frozen. Frozen.
Frozen.
Holy shit. Guys, it ended. Oh, God. If it's that Oracle, I'll shit my pants.
Oh my god. That'd be a wild send, turn 2.
For life.
I paid life for it.
Game is super over, Nick. That's what I was
Yeah.
I thought it was mana still.
No.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
okay.
it's very bad.
And
Your next spell costs 2.
Yeah, your next spell costs you 2.
No.
Yeah, this damning sphere is
Damning
putting in
spheres.
work.
No.
You good?
Yeah, I take it.
That's yeah.
I'm still playing.
Sorry, sorry.
He's still in the game.
Sorry, guys.
Oh, you gotta hit me now.
8 paying 2 extra for Siren Insanity.
Awesome.
Do it.
I'll show you my recap.
Pretty cool.
Wow.
Yeah.
Especially when his next spell costs like 4.
No, I
Wow.
can't do shit.
Otherwise, you lose your hand.
Holy shit.
Yeah, this goes into
My
exile,
hero.
and this goes into my pile.
It's
Yep.
cool.
I think this game is even more fun than the last one.
Even more fun.
Well, thinking how
Overflowing with
miserable
joy.
it was to be under 1 Oppo. What if an entire deck was Oppo?
Yeah.
-10 Tevesh Szat. Gain control of all commanders. Put all commanders from the command zone onto the battlefield under your control. Oh yeah.
I want to respond. To that.
Sure.
Deadly Rollick targeting Valgavoth.
Like a ward trigger, sack 3 non-land permanents. I believe it's no. Put all commanders from the command zone onto the battlefield under your
Put him in the
control.
yard. Put him in the
I'm
yard.
gonna put these in the yard.
Okay.
Wow.
Got it. Wow.
Wait, do those go under Valgavoth?
Yes.
Oh yeah.
That's still fine.
It's
better than this.
Oh.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's
dude.
still fine.
Permanently exiling his commanders.
You know what? I'll take it.
That's freaking.
Trigger kitten target Valgavoth.
What's like the rule of scooping?
We're good to scoop if you guys
happy
want.
to
There's
like
the game.
now.
The game has ended.
Yeah.
Yay.
I was good.
Yay.
Yeah, I'm good.